Welcome to the next video in the formulize tutorial series. So we're going to create a form now. Our sample application is intended to be a reporting form for a nature reserve or wildlife conservation area of some kind. And imagine that there's a form that the staff or volunteers are supposed to use to record when they see certain animals at certain times of day or certain locations, just as part of the work they do, monitoring the situation in the conservation area. So, if that's our scenario, then let's go to the admin section after we've logged in, and let's start creating a form. Now, first of all, a thing to point out here is formulize has this concept of application. And you may have several different services or processes that you have a few forms for, and some of them might be related to each other, but some might be completely different. So there's a concept of application which lets you organize the forms, and by default, forms don't have to be assigned to an application. They would show up here. There are currently no forms that don't belong to an application. There are no forms of any kind. So let's create a new one, and let's call it the wildlife activity form. Now that's what you do. You start it up and you put in the title. You can, if you wish, put in a different text to use in the menu. This form will appear in the menu on the front page for people who have permission. A link to it will appear there. By default, it will use the form's title if that's what it says here, or if you don't, if you want to have something else, you type whatever you want in here. And as it says, if you leave this blank, it won't show up in the menu at all. Other things that you need to do here. Well, there's the form handle. This is optional. This just changes when the form is created. It creates a table in the database to restore the information. If you wish to control the name of that table, you can put the form handle here. If you're writing programming code with the formulize API, knowing the form handle can be important as well. By default, it will just be a number based on this number sequence based on the forms that have been created. An important option is how many entries are allowed in this form. By default, it's more than one entry per user, and that's usually fine, but there are some situations where you might want to use one of the other two options, one entry per group or one entry per user. If you're creating a form that is some sort of group profile form or some shared form shared among the group members, and there's really only one entry that they're all updating or maintaining, then you would pick one entry per group. One entry per user is used more if this is some kind of profile form for an individual, or there's just for some other reason each person is only supposed to fill in that form one time. Then you could pick one entry per user. Formulize will enforce those restrictions if you pick either of those things, but by default, more than one entry per user is what is used most of the time, because that is mostly what you want to do. You want to create a form and then people fill it in over and over again, as in this case, as they see different wildlife doing things, then they're going to want to fill in the form again and again. And here's the application concept that I mentioned. We can create a new application. So let's create a new application called Wildlife Monitoring. And that's it. If we click Save, then we've got our form there, and it's automatically filled in. Number 1 is the form handle. Like I said, there'll be a numeric sequence. So now we know this form is part of the wildlife monitoring application. There's a new option here when showing a list of entries in this form, which elements should be displayed by default. So you can control the default questions or fields in this form that are shown to users by using that. We'll just jump back to, we can go up a level now to wildlife monitoring. Our new application is part of the breadcrumb trail now. It's a known commodity. There's one form in this application, and if we go all the way back to home, there, now we've got application wildlife monitoring with our activity form, and as before, no forms that don't have an application. So anywhere that you see the main form summary here or box, then there's a few different things you can do. Configure is the main option for changing elements in the form, changing permissions, changing any settings. You can view the form with the default screen options, like the hint here says, view the form as users will see it. There's also view the form with all the screen options on. You will change various options for how the form appears to people, as we'll do that as we go through other tutorials. But sometimes, as an administrative user, you might want to interact with just the basic form with all options turned on, even if you've customized it for certain people. So this second view option gives you all of the all the features will be turned on for the form, even if you've changed how it shows up for users normally. You can also clone the form to make a copy of it. You can clone the form including all the data that's already been entered in the form. So good for archiving. If you wanted to make an archived copy of this form, turn off all the permissions maybe, and delete the main one, that's a useful thing to do. There's lockdown, which is used to basically lock a form in its current configuration. No further changes to the form of any kind can be made. That was intended originally as essentially an auditing measure, so that once some things have been set up the way that a group of people had agreed upon, then that could be clicked and no further changes could be made, not even by the administrator. You can also delete the form, of course. And then there's default screens, the entries in the form and the regular form for filling in. We'll talk about screens in a future tutorial. So if we go to configure the form, then we're back here where we ended up after we saved it. And what we have is the settings, which we looked at before. It's the default page with the name and other basic settings. There's elements in the form. We don't have any elements yet that we've created, but there's quite a few we can add, and we'll talk about all of those. There's permissions, different groups, including the ones that were created earlier. We can set permissions for the users in the form. There's screens, which there's a large explanation here for what screens are. The screen concept basically is a screen is a way that you interact with a form. It's a version of the form that is shown to certain users. So there are form screens, the form itself that people fill in, and there's list screens, which is basically a summary of multiple entries that people can review. Kind of like a spreadsheet table, but well, as you'll see, there's more options than typically in a spreadsheet. And there's another thing called procedures, which well, we'll get to in a much later tutorial. It's a very specialized way of doing advanced querying on the data that's in the form if you want to do some very fancy things. So starting with the elements then, let's just start out very simply so we can do a walkthrough of the various parts of the formulize system. We'll start by adding a date, because presumably each of these sightings happens on a date. So date of the activity sighting. And you don't really have to fill in anything else if you don't want to. We can put in help text if you want to give the users extra descriptive information or suggestions for how they should answer this question. There is a column heading. This caption by default is the question that users see in the form when they fill it in. But when you're seeing a summary list of the options, you might want the heading of the column to be different. So that's what the column heading is for. There's a data handle, which is like the form handle. It's optional. It'll be a number sequence if you leave it alone. But when you're doing programming with formulize, you may wish to customize the data handles so they're easier to remember and easier to refer to. You can also control the position of the form. Now there's no elements in this form right now, so our choices are beginning or end, which is the same thing. But when there are a list of elements, then we'll also have the option to put it at the beginning, the end, or immediately after any of the existing elements, just to control its position. By default, elements come in at the end. They just get dropped in one after the other in the order that you create them. So normally, if you're just keeping things simple, all you do is type the caption, and then you move on to the options. Different kinds of elements have different options. There will be separate videos about each one to explain in detail how they work. But some are pretty straightforward, such as the date here. We can pick a default date that we want to always be appear by default in this box when users fill in the form, or we can leave it as YYYYMMDD if you do not want to have a specific date show up. So normally it's recommended you'd leave it as this default value, because if you pick any specific date as time moves on, it'll just be more and more odd that that particular date is the default. There are several display options for elements. You can control which groups see the elements. Maybe certain questions are only relevant for certain users. We'll have some examples of that later. You can disable the element for certain groups, so the element will show up, but people won't be able to interact with it. You can also have the element only show up based on certain display conditions. So we'll have some situations where that's relevant later, such as if a form has been approved by a supervisor, then maybe some additional supervisory questions show up, but they should not show up until that has happened. So you can get quite complex with how and when you want elements to appear. The other choices here, if this element is not displayed to a user, still save its value when the form is submitted. So if there's an element which, because of these display settings, is not available to the user, but it has some important default information, then you can check this, and that default information will still be saved with the form when it's saved, even though the user would have never interacted with that. Normally, the only information that's saved is what the user sends back from the form, but this is a way of enforcing certain defaults always get set even if the user doesn't interact with that element. And only display this element to users who have permission to view private elements. So basically this flags, if you check this off, it's going to flag this element as a quote private element, maybe a home phone number or some other personal information like that. And there is a specific permission in formulize for viewing private elements. Presumably only senior users, webmasters, are going to have that kind of permission. So this is a way of recording information that is sensitive and ensuring that it's only seen by the people who have permission to see it. There's a few advanced options as well. You can encrypt data in the database, although it's not a fully... The problem with encrypting things in databases doesn't fully work in all the possible situations you can do with formulize, because basically when you hide the information in the database by encrypting it, some features just need to know what that information is and they can't work properly without having direct access to it. But it generally works with most features, including basic searching and sorting and other options like that. So if there is some very sensitive information you want to actually encrypt it in the database, you can do that. There's also, not for date options, but for other elements, there are some other advanced features to do with the data typing in the database. I'll talk about those more when we have an element that will respond to them. So anyway, that's the quick overview of what the different element options are. This is just a date box. We're going to leave it with the default year, month, day, default value, no specific date. And we'll save that. And done. And then we can go back to the form and to add another element. We'll add a couple others. Let's add one for the time. Maybe we'll do this as a series of radio buttons. Radio buttons are those options on forms where you have a little circle and you can pick one of many, but you can only pick one of them, not multiple. So we'll say time of day, and now with radio buttons and a few other elements in formulize, the options are a bit different. You can add a few different choices here. Let's add maybe 4 in total, and we'll say morning, midday, evening, and night. You can pick one of them as the default if you wish. If you decide later you don't want that, you can just click clear default and that will go away. There's a few other notes here about different advanced options you can do. We'll talk about those more when we're looking at each element type individually. And a few other options here we'll get to later. Yes, and here is the other advanced option we didn't discuss before. For dates, they're always stored in the database as dates. Sometimes it matters how you're storing things in the database, and you might have a choice about one way or the other. So this advanced option lets you control that. Normally, things in formulize are actually stored as text, unless formulize has reason to think that it's a number. So if formulize, if you've basically set up the element in such a way that you've said this element accepts numbers only, or various options like that that would trigger detecting this as a number, formulize will store it as a number. By default, if there's no particular reason to think it's a number, it's just going to treat it as text. You can manually override the choices that formulize makes by just picking one of these things here, and that will make sure that the information is stored in the database as one of these particular types. That is a fairly advanced option that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you. You should probably just ignore it because formulize does a pretty good job of treating things as the right thing at the right time, as long as you've set the options here in the way that makes sense to you. So that's really all we have to do. We've set our time of day, we've picked our options. We're not going to fiddle with any of the other settings, and save that. And we'll do one other setting for the animal. Not much point in recording that you sighted an animal in the park unless, well, you've got a way of saying what the animal was. So, what type of animal was it? And options, again, different for drop-down boxes or select boxes. Same as for everything else, has its own choices here. Now, there's quite a few for select boxes, as you can see, and we will get into those in detail in a future video just about select boxes. For now, most of the defaults we can leave as is. This is going to be a drop-down list. You can do a few other things depending on what your situation and needs are, but let's keep it as a drop-down list for now. And what are the options that the user can choose from? Well, we're going to use these options just like in our radio buttons. It's the same kind of interface. So let's say black-footed ferret, beaver, wild pig, Atlantic puffin. An odd assortment, I admit, but those are my kids' favorite animals, so that's what I'm going to stick to. And yeah, none of the other things we need to worry about. Generally, the defaults in formulize you can leave as is. It's only when you want something other than sort of the basic options that's when you have to get into fiddling with the other settings. So we'll save that. So that gives us 3 elements in our form. There are many other things we'll add to this form, but we'll do that in a series of videos about each particular element, so you can check all those out if you want to know how each of the other element types behaves and what their options are. And so what this means is we've now got our date, time of day, and animal as the 3 parts of our form. Now, just some other things to point out here that are worth knowing. You can reorder these by dragging. You have to save the changes after dragging if if you've made a change and you want to save it. The way we had it originally is fine, so I'm actually not going to save that. I'm just going to leave that as is. If we go back up to wildlife monitoring, then we'll be ready to click view and go and take a look at this form and interact with it and see what the choices are. But first, there's some other configuration that we should do around the permissions, and so we'll cover that in the next video.